Hello, it's Josh here at Get Real Audio, and this is episode 7 of my basic home recording series. And in this one, we're going to have a look at collaborating. It's quite likely that at some point in your recording practice, you'll want to collaborate with somebody else. That might be a producer or a mix engineer or maybe some other musicians. So today I'm going to talk about how to get audio from other people into your projects and how to get audio from your projects out in various forms that other people might need. First, I'll show you the simplest form of exporting, which is the whole stereo mix that you've worked on so far. That might be to send to a mastering engineer if your mix is complete, or it might be to send to another musician or a collaborator in an incomplete form so that they can add parts or contribute in some way. So I'm going to use the piece I recorded in episode 3 as an example here. This is Apple's Logic software. It looks a little bit like GarageBand but with extra controls. In order to send this file elsewhere or upload it to the internet or send it to a mastering engineer, I need to export a stereo mix of this track. So here are all the individual parts. If I have a look at the mixer page, which is shown by this button here, I can see that there are individual volume sliders for each of the tracks, and I've done some panning. I've moved the parts around in the stereo space a little bit, and the balance sounds about right with the faders in this position. I've played the piece all the way through, and this stereo output track has told me that the loudest volume that all these tracks combined get to is -13 out of a total possible volume of 0. So I could turn this up by 13 decibels without it distorting. You might find that this number is a lot higher. It might be closer to, say, -5 or even over 0. If it goes over 0, then it will distort. So you'll need to turn this fader down by at least the number shown in that box there. It will be red if it's over 0. And let's say you were over by 4 decibels. This would say 4 and it would be red, and you'd need to turn this slider down by at least 4, so sensibly 5 or more decibels, and that's shown in this box here. But I can turn mine up by sensibly 12 decibels. The slider actually only goes up by 6, so I'll do that for now. So bouncing is the word given to exporting in Logic. Other software might call it exporting, and some calls it rendering. Bounce can be accessed in 2 ways in Logic. There's a bounce button actually on the stereo output. If I click that, I come to the bounce dialog window. The other way to get to it is via the file menu and bounce project. And in here I get some choices. I can choose different types of audio. PCM is another word for full quality stereo WAV files. Within PCM I can choose WAV or WAV and some other formats as well. Ultimately we want to make WAV files here, unless of course you want to send this over the internet to a collaborator. Then it can be an MP3, it doesn't matter at that stage. But if this is a final file, then WAV is what we want. The resolution here is, it needs to be the same as the audio we've recorded, so it might be wise for me just to double check what that is. In Logic there is a window that shows you all the audio in the project. So here are all the individual audio files. There's multiple takes of different bits. You can see I did lots of electric guitar takes. Not so many on the snare drum. And they all say 44.1 thousand and 24-bit. So if I go back into my bounce window, I need to double check that those numbers correspond. 44.1 thousand and 24-bit. Great. The bouncing mode, real time and offline, is about how long it might take to bounce. In real time, it'll play the audio to you and you can listen to it as it goes. Offline, it will run as fast as the computer's process can run. That might be faster, and usually is faster than real time, but sometimes if you're running lots and lots of effects plugins, then that might be slower than real time, and it might be the only way you can bounce in that circumstance. Include audio tail is a good idea, just in case you haven't made a selection that's long enough. It will take all the audio with it. And normalizing, this is a safety feature. So normally what normalizing does is it will turn your audio up as loud as it will go without distorting. I don't necessarily recommend you use normalizing to be on, but Logic has this feature which is it won't normalize the audio unless it's going to distort, overload. So overload protection only is a really good feature in Logic, and I recommend you use it. Just before we actually go ahead and bounce this then, we need to check what length our bounce is going to be. At the moment it's going to bounce between bar 2 and bar 15 completely arbitrarily. I'm not sure why it's chosen those numbers. So let's go back out of this window and set up a selection. So we can use the cycle selection in Logic to make this this selection, and you'll notice as soon as I click in the cycle selection bar, I then have this yellow bar that I can drag around in size. So one quite important point about exporting and importing audio and collaborating with other people is we need to know a reference point in time so that everybody's talking the same language and things synchronize when we send things to other people. This project, the music begins quite soon after the beginning of the project, so it's actually only 2 bars of silence with a small count in before the music starts. So there's no reason why I shouldn't be bouncing from the very beginning of the project. That makes things really simple. It means that when audio comes back to me from somebody else, it will have the same space at the beginning before their part starts. Let's say someone wanted to overdub a violin. It may well be that they'll count the 2 bars and then begin on bar 3, just like I did. If your music starts quite a lot later in the project, which is how I normally work, then you'll need to set up a selection that's reliable so you can turn it on and off whenever you need to make a bounce, and it's always the same length and always starts from the same point. You could just choose a point in time or a point in bar numbers depending on which unit of time you're working in. So I've made my selection. It's from the very beginning and it goes further than the very end of the audio. And all I need to do is hit bounce, check that the start and the end time have corresponded to my selection. They have. And hit OK. And now it'll ask me where I want to save it. So I could call this one microphone mix 1, and it's going to go into the project's bounces folder. Okay, now that's done, let's take a look in the Finder and just see how that looks. So this is the project folder we're working on here. Here's the bounces folder, and here is our stereo .wav file that we've created. And that's what we can send to other people. It's a good idea to listen to that before you send it, just in case something went wrong with the bouncing process. Okay, now I'll show you how to import a part that another musician may have performed for your piece. Let's imagine you've sent your stereo mix to a collaborator, a violin player in this case, and they've recorded their part and emailed it back to you. Here's how to export it back into your project. So we're going to assume here that you bounced from the beginning of your project and that you instructed them to provide a piece of audio that was the same length, that started in the same place. In theory, all we need to do is find that file. Here's our violin WAV file, and just drag it into the project, starting at the beginning. So that's lined up with bar 1. In we go. Just giving it a nice violin icon, and it lines up. And if I zoom in, we can see that the audio begins at beginning of bar 3. Now let's imagine that a collaborator has sent you a stereo track and they'd like you to add a part to it. That's fairly straightforward to do. You import the stereo mix they've sent you into one track and you record your part to another track, and now I'll show you how to export that part as a piece of audio. So in this scenario, imagine that I'm a session musician and I'm providing a violin track for the original creator of this music. So I've set up myself a very simple project where I have a track that contains this stereo. You can tell it's stereo because there are 2 sides to the waveform. This symbol here also means stereo. Different DAWs will have different ways of displaying this information. But this is the stereo mix that was sent to me. Here is the part that I've created, and it could well be that this part might have a number of edits in it. It may well not begin at the very start of the project. All manner of different things. Ultimately, whatever's happening on this track here, you need to export as a single piece of audio that starts from the very beginning of the project. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this, and it again depends on your DAW. In Logic, it's a very simple way. You simply select the track that you want to export, and we go to File, Export, One Track as Audio. So you want to export the track, not the region, because that might only be a small portion of the track, the whole track. And in here, there are similar options to the ones that we saw earlier on. Let's just point this at the appropriate folder. I'm going to put it in the bounces folder again. So, for example, you could trim the silence at the end. That seems sensible. It's no point in bouncing forever if there's nothing happening there. Save format is a WAV file again. Bit depth 24-bit. It doesn't ask you about sample rate in this particular window. It assumes you want it to be the same. You can bypass the plugins that you've put on that track. Let's say you had some reverb on there just so it sounded nice while you worked. It's not a good idea to send that to the original creator of the music with the effects on. They'll want it in its rawest form so that they can make their own decisions about it. So let's bypass the effects, and we're not going to include any volume automation in case you had applied any. Again, normalize overload protection on, and that's it. We're just going to go to export. Out it goes. I believe I chose a folder for that. Yes, I did. My New Part. There we go. So that's the name of the track, My New Part. In actual fact, before I send it to my collaborator, I might name it sensibly, something like that. And that's my mono part, which is just a copy of that track in one audio file. Now, in other DAWs, it might not be as straightforward as that. Another simple way of exporting parts from any DAW is to just solo the track you want to bounce, or alternatively mute all the other tracks that you don't want to bounce so that only your part can play. And either, again, in the mixer page where the bounce button is, or in the file bounce project selection, you can then, oh sorry, we need to make our time selection again. So let's just turn on the cycle selection, make sure it goes from the very beginning of the project, and then we'll go bounce project. Now, the only drawback of doing it this way is this will create a stereo file. There's nothing inherently stereo about it. It'll just be a copy of the same sound on the left and the right side. It's a waste of disk space for this to be stereo, and because there's no stereo information, we only used a single microphone to record this, and as we can see by this symbol here, it says it's a mono track. But in Logic, there is no way of bouncing a mono output here. File type, interleaved or split. These are stereo file types. Interleaved is a single stereo file. Split will make one for left and one for right. So it's a needlessly file space hungry way of doing it, but it will work and people will accept it at the other end. Other DAWs will allow you to make this a mono or a mono summed file at this stage, and that's absolutely fine. I know Pro Tools will allow you to do that. So the aim here is to try and export mono tracks if they are mono. If they're stereo tracks, let's say you used a pair of microphones on something, then export it as stereo by all means. Lastly, I'll show you how to export individual tracks as complete pieces of audio so that you can send them to me to mix or to another mix engineer. Okay, so we're going to follow the same logic we used when we were exporting our individual part here to export all of these tracks so that we can send them to a mix engineer. My mixer page only contains a single plugin, which is a guitar amp simulator plugin. I didn't use a real guitar amplifier. I plugged my guitar straight into my audio interface and used this one to make the sound. So we can make a decision here. We could either bounce with effects on, so that this guitar has its amp sound, or without, and we can let the mix engineer make their own decision regarding amp simulation. I think in this case I'm going to leave effects on. So this is global. All the effects in the mixer will be left on when I choose to include effects, but there's only one effect in the whole mixer, so I'm really aware of what I'm doing here. I'm double checking that every single track is mono, see as a single circle rather than the double interlocked circle which is stereo. On every single track they're all mono. Great. This one is stereo because it's our stereo output, by the way. And now all we need to do is select all of the tracks. I'm holding down Shift when I click the bottom one. File, export 10 tracks as audio files, and exactly as it just worked for us with our individual parts, this will now export 10 mono WAV files. I'm not going to bypass effect plugins so that we get our amp simulator, as I just mentioned. I am not going to include volume automation though. I'll let the mix engineer make those decisions. And whilst bouncing, I just noticed something which is a worthy consideration. 2 of my tracks have a fade out at the end of them. In Logic, that's achieved by using the fade tool here. Now, it might be a better idea not to include those. So if you have a specific fade in, fade out requirement for the piece of music and you want to explain it to the mix engineer, it's a good idea to give them a reference so they can hear what you mean. But it's always better to leave all of the noise from the end of the track in place if you can when sending to a mix engineer. The reason being is they may well have tools available to them which can reduce the level of noise, but they'll need a sample of the noise in order to do that. So I often receive songs to mix where people have cut the end of the song off really sharply because they thought it was too noisy. What that does is it removes the ability for me to then remove the noise from what's left of the tail, and you end up with a very abrupt cut at the end of the piece of music. So both of those things don't sound so good, and I now don't have the ability to fix it. So I'm just going to remove the fade on that track and on that track before I do my export. So the result we're looking for in a Finder window here is a folder full of individual files. So now, acting as the receiving mix engineer, I've opened a different DAW here. This one's Pro Tools, and as you can see, Pro Tools begins very empty until you do anything like create tracks. And all I need to do, in theory, if these files have been prepared properly, is just drop them in, and it will make 10 individual tracks, and it will show me those 10 individual waveforms. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. So the volumes are all over the place, but the files are in place and they're in sync, and now I can do my job and balance those parts appropriately and make them sound nice by adding processing and various other tricks. And that's the end of the series. Thanks for watching, and please get in touch if you'd like me to mix or master any of the work you've made at home, and please comment below if you have any questions about things I've covered in the series.